As tensions between the United States and China intensify, the Senate passed legislation that could potentially ban some Chinese companies from listing shares on U.S. exchanges. One of the sponsors of the bill, Senator Chris Van Hollen, joins us right now. And Senator, thank you for being here today.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Let's talk a little bit about what this bill does and why you brought it, why you're sponsoring this bill. What's the reason behind it?
So this is a bill I introduced with Senator John Kennedy. It's a bipartisan bill. It passed the United States Senate unanimously yesterday, and it's designed to help protect American investors. And the premise is very simple, which is that all companies listed on U.S. stock exchanges should comply with the same uniform standards, especially with respect to accounting under the Public Companies Accounting Oversight Board. And companies from every country in the world are complying now, except China. And the government of China has essentially prohibited their companies from opening their procedures to the same standards that every other company that lists on our exchanges. So this is to protect investors. We introduced this long before the outbreak of the coronavirus. This is important. Years ago, U.S. investors were bilked out of over $40 billion from Chinese companies that did not comply with these standards. So this is long overdue.
Alibaba shares were down by about 2% on news of that unanimous consent that you mentioned. We also look at shares of Baidu and other companies that American investors have really been clamoring to kind of get their hands on. They've been darlings here. Do you have suspicions about those companies in particular? What got you to this point that made you think that there's a problem that needs to be fixed?
Well, the problem is that we know from what happened years ago that U.S. investors lost lots of money because Chinese companies were not complying with these standards. And it turned out that mom and pop investors got bilked out of billions of dollars. And there's nothing that prevents these companies from being listed on the exchanges under our bill. They just have to comply by the same rules that every other company in every other country has to comply with. And we give them 3 years to come into compliance. So the companies you just mentioned can continue to list on the U.S. exchanges so long as they comply with the same rules as everybody else to protect U.S. investors.
Have you heard from these companies in particular or from the exchanges where they're listed? And I wonder if you blame the exchanges for allowing them to list.
Well, we urge the exchanges to take this kind of action. We also urge the SEC to put more pressure on companies in China. A lot of these negotiations should have taken place, back around 2009, 2010, when a lot of these companies were joining the U.S. exchanges. But we haven't gotten a lot of pushback. No, I mean, there were some concerns raised initially, but we provide this 3-year period for these companies to come into compliance. And look, in China, as we know, all of these companies are subject to the dictates of the government of China. And so it's simply a matter of allowing their companies to comply by the same standards as everybody else. Look, I think these companies are
Senator,
still going to want access
just said, though,
to the U.S. capital markets. Yeah.
What you just said makes it seem like there is no way that they would actually be able to get in line with compliance. You just said everyone knows these companies are subject to the whims of the Chinese government. So is there any way any of these companies can actually prove to you, as the bill requires them to do, that they're not subject to that?
What it requires is that they subject their books to the same accounting standards as every other company in the world. And I think the government of China will now be pressured to allow those companies to do so in order to continue to have these major Chinese companies listed on the exchange in order to protect American investors. So I think at this point, now that we've passed this law, it's heading to the House, that the government of China will have to reconsider, because I think they want these companies to have access to the U.S. capital markets. As you say, there have been a lot of people who invested in these companies. But it's not just the big name companies. There are lots of other smaller Chinese companies that are listed that are not complying with the rules. A lot of investors believe that every company listed on the exchange is held to the same standards when it comes to accounting. And the reality is that has not been the case with respect to these Chinese companies. And so this is designed to make sure that everybody plays by the same rules and that investors can have confidence that everybody's playing by the same rules.
Senator, can I ask you about the timing of what is clearly a strategy of sorts to escalate conflict and tension with China right now in the midst of this pandemic? And I'm not going to try to dissuade you of any of your views about the disclosure rules or anything else, but it seems to me that as we escalate this conflict right now, there's a strategic real question and risk that we put ourselves at, which is to say that we still rely on China for access to PPE, which we still can't manufacture here in the United States, for supplies, for access to certain ingredients that are going to be required for drugs. There's a whole supply chain that we are literally that's necessary for us to keep going in this particular moment. And whether you think that we put any of that at risk by approaching it the way we are right now in the middle of this. Not to say we shouldn't do it in the future, but doing it now.
Well, as I indicated, Senator Kennedy and I introduced this bill more than a year ago, just as part of the overall effort to even the playing field a little bit between U.S. companies and Chinese companies. I have disagreed with a lot of the Trump administration's trade policies with respect to China. I have supported their policies with respect to, preventing theft of IP and their efforts to make sure that we crack down on Huawei and some of the practices that it's engaged in. But this was not designed to be part of an overall attack on China at this particular point in time because of the coronavirus. In fact, it's my view that while China obviously was not as transparent as it should have been, that the Trump administration and President Trump in particular are just trying to distract attention from his own negligence with respect to getting on top of this virus in the United States. By pointing a finger at China. So I do not see this as part of that effort. As I indicated, this is designed to protect American investors. Chinese companies were the only companies in the world that were not held to this standard. And we introduced it a long time ago as part of that investor protection strategy. If you're
Senator,
asking me whether or
for
not
being
we
with
should
us
be
today.
escalating our with China, I don't think we should be doing it unnecessarily and poking people in the eye unnecessarily. I think we should continue the strategy that we've been engaged in to try to prevent the theft of IP and to address real challenges like Huawei.